In the early years of the 20th century, as steel monsters began to roll across battlefields, the world's armies faced a new problem. Heavy armor had rendered the rifle obsolete against tanks, and artillery was too slow to redeploy. Soldiers on the ground needed something portable, something that could punch through metal and even the odds. The story of that idea would travel from laboratories in Europe to jungles in Asia, and eventually to almost every war zone on Earth. It began in 1931 in the Soviet Union, where engineers were experimenting with a shoulder-launched weapon known as the RS-65. It was primitive, unreliable, and lacked the shaped charge warhead that would later define modern anti-tank weapons. The technology was too early for its time. The concept was promising aim, fire, destroy, but the execution lagged behind. Still, those experiments planted a seed that would wait 3 decades to bloom. The real breakthrough came years later, during the chaos of the Second World War. Across the Atlantic, American engineers introduced a simple, almost elegant invention: the bazooka. It was a lightweight, tube-shaped launcher capable of firing a rocket propelled by a small motor. More importantly, it carried a shaped charge explosive designed to burn through armor using concentrated energy rather than brute force. When German forces captured several bazookas early in the war, their reaction was both predictable and immediate. They believed they could do it better. The result was the Panzerschreck, literally meaning tank terror. It was larger, more powerful, and capable of punching through 200 millimeters of armor, enough to make even the most confident Allied tank crews sweat. The Panzerschreck, however, was not without problems. It required a trained crew, and the weapon's backblast could be deadly to anyone standing too close. Germany's engineers, practical as ever, decided they needed something smaller, cheaper, and simple enough for any soldier to use. It was disposable, one shot only. The earliest versions were limited to about 30 meters of effective range, barely the length of a city street, but later models stretched beyond 100 meters, and their warheads grew larger and more efficient. Plans for an even more advanced Panzerfaust. 250 were already drawn up before the war's end, but the collapse of Nazi Germany left them unrealized. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was watching. Throughout the war, its soldiers relied mostly on anti-tank rifles and field guns, effective but cumbersome. The idea of a soldier carrying a compact launcher that could defeat armor fascinated Soviet engineers. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Soviet design bureaus began dissecting everything the Americans and Germans had built. They didn't copy any one weapon directly. Instead, they tried to combine the best elements from all sides. The result was the RPG-1, a crude but conceptually brilliant experiment. It featured a 1-meter-long launch tube, a sharply angled pistol grip, and a wooden shield designed to protect the operator from the rocket's heat. Though the design looked promising, it suffered from serious flaws. Its range was short, its accuracy questionable, and the rocket's reliability poor. Tests showed that sometimes it failed to ignite, and sometimes it exploded too early. Soviet soldiers joked that the RPG-1 was as dangerous to the shooter as to the target. Yet in those failures lay the blueprint for success. The following iteration, the RPG-2, solved most of the earlier problems. It introduced a more powerful propellant charge, a longer effective range, and a sturdier warhead with 80 millimeters of caliber. The weapon could now penetrate roughly 225 millimeters of armor, enough to disable most tanks of the early Cold War era. By 1954, it had entered service with both Soviet and Chinese forces, marking the first real step in a legacy that would stretch far beyond its creator's imagination. Its debut in combat would come soon after, in the thick jungles of Vietnam. There, the simplicity of the launcher became its deadliest advantage. American patrols quickly learned to fear the small puff of smoke that preceded a rocket streaking from the foliage. Lightly armored vehicles, such as the M113 personnel carrier, could be torn apart by a single hit. Even heavier tanks, like the M48 and M60, were vulnerable when struck in the right spot. The RPG-2 was not just a weapon, it was an equalizer. It gave lightly armed fighters the means to challenge machines worth millions. Still, engineers were not satisfied. Each success invited a new question. How much further could they push this design? Experiments with larger warheads, stronger propellant charges, and new optical sights followed. The intermediate model, the RPG-4, was never widely produced, but it served as a bridge toward the weapon that would define the next 6 decades of warfare. By the dawn of the 1960s, the Soviet Union had refined the formula into something extraordinary: a reusable, rugged, and brutally effective anti-tank launcher. It was as much a symbol of industrial pragmatism as of military innovation. Unlike Western designs, which often favored complexity, the Soviet philosophy valued simplicity above all. A weapon should work even in mud, in sand, in the freezing cold. When the RPG-7 entered service in 1961, it did so not as a marvel of technology, but as a triumph of logic. Its steel tube was only a few millimeters thick, yet resistant to rust. It required no delicate maintenance and could fire again and again with minimal care. Ammunition was loaded from the front, secured by a simple mechanical notch. Its warhead extended beyond the diameter of the tube, allowing for a larger explosive charge without increasing the launcher's bulk. The philosophy behind it was almost poetic in its brutality. If you cannot afford to build perfect machines, build weapons that destroy them instead. The Soviets had created not just a launcher, but a tool of asymmetry, one that would shift the balance of warfare for generations. In dusty training grounds from Siberia to the Caucasus, young conscripts learned to handle the new weapon. They were told that even the mightiest Western tanks could be defeated with a single, well-placed shot. The numbers etched in their manuals: 200 meters of effective range, over 200 millimeters of armor penetration, were not just statistics but promises. The RPG-7 had arrived quietly, but its echo would soon circle the world. From the frozen steppes where it was born to the tropical jungles where it first drew blood, it embodied a paradox that would haunt modern warfare. The simplest inventions often outlive the most sophisticated ones. The path from an awkward prototype to a battlefield staple rarely follows a straight line. Designs stumble, parts fail, and ideas that seem brilliant in theory collapse under the weight of real combat. The evolution of the handheld anti-tank launcher was a patient, iterative process driven by a single obsession: how to make a weapon both simple and lethal. Engineers learned fast that solving one problem often revealed another, and each new version became a compromise between recoil, weight, reliability, and the brutal arithmetic of war economies. The first practical Soviet attempt retained the name RPG, followed by the number 1. It was little more than a laboratory sketch given metal and wood. The long launch tube forced soldiers to lug unwieldy hardware across trenches and into ruined buildings. The wooden handguard offered protection from heat, but provided little against the realities of combat. The warhead lacked the optimized shape and lining necessary to produce a focused metal jet, and the propellant charge proved inconsistent in cold weather. Trials showed that a well-trained crew might deliver a useful strike at very close range, but in the chaos of a firefight, those ideal conditions were rare. Rather than abandon the concept, designers returned to fundamentals. The RPG-2 represented a new philosophy: shrink what could be shrunk, reinforce what must be reinforced, and tolerate imperfection everywhere else. The launch tube remained a mainstay, but it was shortened and made lighter. The grip geometry changed so that ordinary conscripts could shoulder and fire the weapon with minimal instruction. Engineers experimented with different propellant charges and delivery systems until they found a combination that produced a more stable flight and longer reach. The warhead grew in diameter and in practicality. An 80mm shaped charge became the baseline for penetration goals that matched the armor of the era. The improvements were not purely mechanical. Manufacturing doctrine shifted toward modularity and mass production techniques that favored simple tooling over exquisite tolerances. Factories across the Soviet sphere learned to make barrels, boosters, and warheads at scale. This approach reduced unit costs and made replacement parts easier to store and ship. The doctrine that shaped the design was political as much as technical. A weapon that could be produced cheaply in large numbers fit the strategic needs of a state that planned for attrition rather than surgical engagements. Armies that could flood a battlefield with thousands of identical weapons forced opponents to rethink armor doctrine and logistics. Field feedback then shaped subsequent models. Soldiers reported how the launcher behaved under stress, how the sighting systems performed at dawn and dusk, and how often a dud round became a ricochet hazard. These practical observations led to design choices that would become signature traits. The launcher would accept front-loaded projectiles, simplifying the loading process in cramped spaces. A simple notch would lock the projectile in place with minimal moving parts. The rear of the tube would be engineered to direct backblast in a predictable cone so that crews could learn safe firing positions. These were small changes, but they mattered greatly when dozens of weapons were fired in succession. By the time the next generation arrived, engineers had embraced the necessity of multiple warhead types. The original emphasis on armor penetration proved insufficient in the varied forms of modern conflict. Urban fights demanded munitions that could demolish concrete and clear rooms. Anti-personnel fragmentation rounds offered utility when the goal was suppressive fire rather than vehicle kills. Thermobaric warheads emerged as a terrifying answer to fortified positions, releasing fuel aerosols that detonated to create intense heat and overpressure in enclosed spaces. The choice to diversify rounds turned a mere anti-tank tool into a versatile infantry asset. The late 50s and early 60s saw the culmination of these efforts. The model that would be known to the world combined rugged simplicity with a surprising flexibility. Its tube was thin-walled and chrome-lined, resisting corrosion and surviving neglect. The front-loaded projectile design remained, but the warhead profile was optimized for shaped charge performance. Stabilizing fins folded away during the initial boost and deployed once the projectile cleared the launcher, ensuring a steadier flight and better accuracy at reach. The firing sequence adopted a two-stage logic: a small booster to clear the tube and a sustainer rocket to drive the warhead toward the target. This arrangement allowed for a compact launcher while permitting larger and more effective warheads. Military schools shortened the time needed to bring a recruit to functional competence. Where earlier weapons required extended drills, the newer launchers could be put to basic use after a few hours of familiarization. Manuals emphasized range estimation without complex optics, use of natural cover, and the avoidance of enclosed spaces during firing. Unit tactics taught teams how to position spotters and loaders, how to withdraw after firing, and how to exploit the weapon's strengths in ambushes. This human factor was crucial. A design is only as effective as the people who employ it. Comparison with other systems deepened the appreciation for the new launcher's philosophy. Western anti-tank options often relied on more complex sighting equipment or reusable shoulder tubes that demanded regular maintenance. The Soviet style preferred robustness and redundancy. If a sight failed, iron sights remained usable. If a launcher was dented, it still fired. The ethos was simple: make weapons that will not be a burden to the nation, in pieces and men in poverty. Manufacturing scale proved decisive. Factories that once produced field guns learned to repurpose lines for launch tubes and warhead casings. Supply chains adapted to need, and the weapons arrived not only in national arsenals, but also in the hands of allies and proxy forces. This diffusion was intentional in some quarters and inadvertent in others. Exported as a strategic good, supplied as a gesture of alliance, or acquired second-hand on a black market, the launcher found its way far beyond the borders of its birth state. Even as the design stabilized, enemies found ways to adapt. Spaced armor, applique plates, and explosive reactive tiles arrived as countermeasures. Each counter invited new warhead concepts, including tandem charges designed to defeat reactive armor by using a precursor charge to neutralize the countermeasure before the main charge struck. This cat and mouse of offense and defense would become a theme carried into future decades. But the core lesson remained constant. A simple, well-made launcher placed the power of armor defeat into the hands of infantry in ways that reshaped tactics and justified mass production. By the time the launcher entered widespread service, it was less a single weapon than a family. A basic tube and a catalogue of warheads that could be mixed and matched to meet the demands of widely differing battlefields. Its success owed as much to factory discipline and doctrinal clarity as to any single engineering breakthrough. The weapon's design journey was a study in practical problem-solving. Reduce complexity where possible, and concentrate sophistication where it mattered most. The result was a tool that could be taught quickly, produced cheaply, and used lethally across a vast range of conflicts. The launcher looks deceptively simple. A hollow tube, a trigger, a sight, and at the rear, a cone that eats heat and directs the angry breath of the engine away from the shooter. Yet within that modest silhouette is a choreography of physics and engineering that turns a shoulder-held device into a weapon capable of rewriting the life of a vehicle and the fate of the men inside it. Understanding how it works requires following the projectile from cradle to impact, and then listening to what happens when shaped explosives meet steel. The projectile is inserted nose first and slides back until a shallow notch in the tube locks into a groove on the round. This front-loaded arrangement allows the warhead to be larger than the tube, an elegant trick that keeps the launcher compact while permitting a heavy, effective, explosive charge. A small booster charge at the base of the warhead performs the initial task. When the trigger is pulled, the booster, essentially a blank cartridge, expels the round from the tube to a safe clearance distance, typically about 11 meters. At that point, a sustainer rocket ignites, accelerating the projectile to its cruising speed. The sustainer preserves momentum over distance, while folded fins pop out to stabilize flight, turning a tumbling brick into an arrow. The backblast is a defining feature and a tactical constraint. The launch sequence produces a cone of high-temperature, high-pressure gas directed rearward. For safe operation, an operator needs clear space behind him, measured in meters rather than centimeters. Firing from enclosed structures or with troops too close behind invites injury or worse. This danger-shaped doctrine, teams developed firing drills, angles of withdrawal, and staging areas designed to minimize friendly casualties. The backblast also means that firing positions are often chosen for clearance rather than concealment, a compromise between stealth and survivability. At the heart of the most feared warhead is the shaped charge. Its principle is both elegant and merciless. A conical cavity lines the inside of the warhead nose. That cone is backed by a thin metal liner, often copper. When the explosive surrounding the cone detonates, the energy collapses the liner inward, forming a jet of metal fragments that travels downrange at extreme velocity. This jet concentrates energy into a small area, eroding armor by sheer localized force rather than by blunt kinetic impact. Typical jet velocities, when the effect works well, reach the order of 10,000 meters per second against a homogeneous steel plate. A well-made shaped charge can punch through armor measured in hundreds of millimeters. In practice, early effective warheads could breach around 260 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor on a direct hit, a figure that in the early Cold War equated to frontal vulnerability for many contemporary tanks. Not every round behaves as intended. Real life imposes messy probabilities. Temperature extremes, rough handling, and manufacturing variants can convert a lethal projectile into a harmless dud, or worse, a premature detonation that maims the operator. To mitigate these risks, engineers added safe and arming mechanisms. A plastic cap and safety pin on the nose prevent the fuse from engaging until the round is deliberately armed. There is also a self-destruct timer set into many designs so that if a projectile fails to strike a target, it will render itself inert after a set distance. In many models, this self-destruct distance is set at 900 meters. The timer reduces unexploded ordnance, returning to the battlefield as hazards, but it cannot remove every risk associated with sloppy storage or improvised use. Variants expand the launcher's role far beyond armor defeat. Fragmentation rounds trade penetration for blast and shrapnel, useful for clearing open positions and inflicting casualties among exposed infantry. Thermobaric munitions introduce a different kind of violence. On impact, a small charge disperses a fuel aerosol and milliseconds later ignites that cloud to produce intense heat and a sustained overpressure. A room that survives the initial detonation collapses under the pressure wave and consuming heat. Thermobaric rounds thus became a weapon of choice for bunker clearing and urban assault, yet their use raises acute moral questions because of the suffering they inflict in enclosed environments. Tandem warheads represent a technological counter to protective innovations. Explosive, reactive armor arrive to blunt the shaped charge's effectiveness. Reactive tiles detonate outward when struck, disrupting the shaped charge jet. A tandem warhead counters this by placing a small precursor charge at the nose of the round. The precursor detonates first to neutralize the reactive tile, and the main charge follows fractions of a second later to strike the underlying armor. This sequence demands precise timing and reliable fusing. It is an elegant solution to a deadly problem, but it also increases complexity and cost. Guidance in the strict sense is absent. These systems are aimed and fired by human eyes and hands. Some later models incorporated rudimentary optics with reticles, graduated for range, but effective engagement depends on range estimation. Wind and target motion. In practice, the effective precision envelope sits well below the theoretical sighting distance. Most trained crews expect real first-hit probability against point targets at ranges under 300 meters. Beyond that, the weapon becomes an area effect tool more than a precision instrument. The operation is often a team act. One soldier shoulders and fires, while another carries spare rounds, checks, fuses, and watches the flanks. Teams learn to coordinate. A spotter calls range. A loader prepares the next round. The shooter slings, aims, and fires, and then the unit melts back into cover. In ambushes, this choreography becomes lethal. A sudden puff of smoke in foliage, a short, distinctive scream of a rocket, and a vehicle struck in its weaker flank is often immobilized or destroyed outright. Many successful attacks rely less on one perfect shot and more on volume and coordination. Multiple strikes to the same vehicle increase the chance of catastrophic kill, or at least mission kill. There are trade-offs and constraints that never disappear. The backblast limits indoor or very close quarters use unless the team accepts the risk. Tandem charges raise costs and complicate logistics. Thermobaric rounds satisfy tactical needs but inflict terrible collateral damage. Reliability depends on storage, maintenance, and care that are not guaranteed in every theatre. Yet for infantry in need of a compact, transportable, and versatile anti-armor option, the system fills an enduring niche. It takes only a modest investment of resources and a short training cycle to place a potent tool of destruction into the hands of countless irregular fighters. That fact explains much of the weapon's ubiquity and the fierce debates it sparks about force, protection, and the limits of modern armor. The machine and its warheads do not decide policy, but they shape the options available to commanders and to the people who must survive the wars they make more lethal. When a weapon is cheap, light, and effective, geography ceases to be a limit. The launcher that had been refined on Soviet proving grounds found a stage far larger than any single nation. It arrived first in environments where its virtues mattered most. Dense vegetation, narrow streets, and improvised tactics turned the launcher from a technical curiosity into a symbol of asymmetric warfare. In those places, soldiers with little in the way of heavy logistics could inflict disproportionate damage on mechanized forces armed with expensive machines. Its baptism of fire arrived in the humid green of Southeast Asia, where jungle and ambush suited it perfectly. Small units learned to place teams along likely approach routes and to wait until a vehicle filled a kill zone. One well-timed shot could destroy the engine, blow away a track, or set off ammunition inside a cramped personnel carrier. Infectious fear spread among crews because the weapon was invisible until the smoke and scream of the rocket announced the strike. Light armored vehicles designed for mobility rather than protection were particularly vulnerable, and convoys learned to disperse, to change approach routes, and to avoid choke points that turned them into predictable targets. The pattern repeated itself in the deserts and cities of the Middle East. In open terrain, crews relied on concealment and sudden strikes. In towns and dense urban networks, the launcher prospered. Fighters established firing positions on building rooftops or in upper stories so that the weapon could be aimed at weak roof armor or turret tops. Vertical geometry changed the calculus of defense because many tanks have thinner protection on their roofs. A rocket delivered from above had an advantage that frontal armor could not meet. Urban ambush became choreography. Teams used snipers and forward observers to spot targets. Spotters called range, loaders passed the next round, and shooters fired from prepared positions that offered both a clear line of sight and an escape route. When multiple teams coordinated strikes, the results were catastrophic for the defenders. The weapon also flourished where non-state actors and insurgent groups found advantages in a low barrier to entry. Because the launcher could be taught and produced at scale, arsenals spread beyond the control of governments. Some transfers were deliberate, a strategic export to allies and proxies. Others were chaotic, the result of collapsing states, corrupt supply chains, or looted depots. It moved through broker networks and across porous borders until it became part of the standard armament of many irregular forces. It changed incentives for international actors. States that once relied on heavy armor began to adapt doctrine and procurement to anticipate urban and guerrilla environments. Convoys rearranged formations and dismounted patrols augmented vehicles with infantry screens. Armor alone would no longer guarantee safety. On the other side, fighters without heavy industry could still pose existential risks to mechanized formations. The balance of initiative shifted toward those who could blend into a population and strike with concentrated, sudden violence. The psychological effect has always been as important as the physical one. A crew that knows its vehicle might be disabled by a single cheap projectile behaves differently. Caution replaces aggression. Speed slow. Routes multiply. Commanders worry not only about casualties and hardware, but about morale. The launcher became not only an instrument of destruction, but also a tool for shaping behavior on the battlefield. It forced larger forces to expose themselves to new vulnerabilities and to expend resources on countermeasures that had to be carried, maintained, and replaced. The weapon's ubiquity was also visible in more brutal examples. Urban fighting in the North Caucasus showed how columns could be torn apart when ambushes exploited urban geometry and local knowledge. Mechanized formations accustomed to open terrain found themselves in streets where elevation and concealment negated much of their advantage. The attacker did not always need to destroy every vehicle. Immobilizing a tank by stopping its drivetrain or breaking its turret ring was often sufficient. Immobilized machines became liabilities, public monuments to failure that required recovery operations and left exposed flanks that shaped subsequent fights. Modern conflicts revealed new permutations of the weapon. In some theaters, commanders organized massed volleys of rockets to saturate active protection systems and to exhaust the limited number of interceptors carried by those defensive suites. When several projectiles arrived within short intervals, the probability of at least one getting through increased. That tactic turned numbers into a strategy. Other adaptations married the warhead to new delivery systems. Small unmanned aerial vehicles carried shaped charges into angles that ground shooters could not easily reach. A drone could approach quietly and place a warhead on a vehicle roof with an accuracy that eliminated the disadvantage of low impact velocity. These innovations retained the same fundamental logic, but multiplied the contexts in which the weapon could be used. The social cost of diffusion was severe. Weapons that spread into neighborhoods, into militias, and into criminal networks blurred the line between combatant and civilian. A launcher repurposed for criminal violence elevated the stakes of policing and deepened community trauma. Families learned that a cheap projectile could kill not only soldiers but also neighbors and kin. Reconstruction had to reckon not only with shattered structures, but with the psychological imprint of sudden destruction. In many places, the presence of such weapons delayed the recovery of civil life because their existence sustained fear long after active battles subsided. Some states pursued tighter export controls and improved monitoring of arms transfers. Others increased support for armor modernization and active defense research. Yet these measures often lagged behind the speed at which the launcher proliferated. The reality remained that a production line in one country could, through official transfers and unauthorized channels, seed conflicts thousands of kilometers away. The weapon's material simplicity meant that even modest industrial capacity could produce components or replicas. For commanders and civilians alike, the launcher altered expectations. Battles would be fought not only in fields and on roads, but in alleys, stairwells, and on the roofs of apartment blocks. The presence of such a weapon demanded new tactics and, crucially, new humility about the limits of technology. No armor was absolute. No defensive system proved perfect. The proliferation of a cheap, effective weapon rewrote the rules of engagement in countless theaters, compelling armies to adapt and societies to live with a new normal, where danger could come from a single, unremarkable tube and the men who carried it. The arrival of a cheap and effective threat forced defenders to invent responses that ranged from the improvised to the cutting edge. At first, the answers were humble and ad hoc. Crews hammered together wooden planks, stacked sandbags, and lashed scrap metal to hulls. These measures worked on a principle as old as siegecraft. Add layers that break or disrupt the attacker before it reaches the critical target. A shaped charge that detonated a short distance from the outer skin lost much of its destructive focus. Spaced armor, in its most rudimentary form, tended to detonate or deform the jet prematurely. In many early encounters, a sheet of timber, or even a box filled with gravel, provided enough of a buffer to turn a lethal hit into a damaging but survivable one. Those improvised fixes were never elegant and could be dangerous in their own right. Extra weight upset suspension and mobility. Uneven loads reduced speed and increased mechanical failures. Crews carried the added burden of carrying and mounting clumsy protections while under fire. Yet the trade-off was often acceptable. Mobility could be sacrificed for survivability because immobilization in a combat zone often meant destruction or capture. The improvised approach revealed a basic truth. Cost-effective offense produces pressure for cost-effective defense, which cascades into tactical change. The industrial answer evolved in several strands. One approach was to increase passive protection by bolting additional plates to vulnerable areas. Applique armor and add-on plates thickened exposure points and were particularly useful on side and rear arcs, where original designs often left weaker steel. Another line of response involved cage armor, which became known by many as slat armor. A grid of vertical bars or light metal cages placed at a calculated distance from the hull would cause a shaped charge warhead to behave unpredictably. The blast interaction occurred away from the main armor, reducing penetration. Slat armor had the virtue of being relatively light, cheap to manufacture, and quick to install. It did not solve the problem entirely, but it forced attackers to aim for different points and to risk longer exposure to return fire. A more dramatic solution was explosive, reactive armor. These were tiles mounted on a plate that contained a thin layer of explosive. When a shaped charge or certain kinetic round struck the tile, the explosive detonated outward and blew the outer layer away. The motion disturbed the shaped charge jet and reduced its penetration. Reactive armor worked well enough to change the calculus of engagement. It was particularly effective against single-charge warheads, and in many theaters it saved tanks that otherwise would have been lost. Yet reactive armor introduced its own problems. The tiles could injure nearby dismounts when they detonated. They added mass and complexity to logistics because damaged tiles needed replacement. Furthermore, tacticians soon observed ways to defeat reactive armor. Attackers adapted tandem charge munitions that used a small precursor to detonate the reactive tile and the main charge to follow through. This iterative escalation made clear that every defensive innovation carries the seed of a new offense. The next chapter of defense moved into electronics and speed. Soft kill systems sought to confuse or deny the attacker by obscuring the target or by disrupting guidance. smoke screens designed to mask infrared or visual acquisition, laser dazzlers that blinded seekers, and active jamming systems all belonged to this category. Soft kill measures had the advantage of being less likely to cause collateral harm, but they were useful mainly against guided munitions. Unguided rockets and hand-launched rounds did not rely on seekers. They were aimed by sight rather than electronics, which left soft kill measures of limited use against the shoulder-fired threat. That limitation drove development toward hard kill solutions. Active protection systems were developed to detect incoming projectiles and then to physically intercept or deflect them before they struck armor. These systems used radar or other sensors to give a warning and then launched counter-munitions that detonated near the incoming warhead. In practice, hard kill systems created a brief cloud of fragments or a directed blast that broke up the shaped charge or shifted its point of impact. They represented a profound shift. For the first time, an armored vehicle could mount defenses that operated in the last few meters of flight, converting passive resilience into proactive interception. Hard kill technologies offered a powerful promise, but their limitations were real and consequential. Sensors sometimes failed. Counter-munitions had limited inventories and could be exhausted by waves of incoming fire. Installations of active protection raised operational questions about the safety of accompanying infantry. A system that detonates close to a vehicle risks injuring troops riding on or operating beside it, which meant commanders often had to decide when to enable and when to suppress the system. The rules of engagement and the geometry of combat forced compromises. In many documented engagements, crews disabled or limited active defenses to avoid friendly harm, which left them vulnerable. Others accepted the risk and operated the systems in automatic mode, with the attendant chance that an interceptor might harm nearby non-combatants. The economics of defense also mattered. Advanced protection systems were costly. Not every army could equip every vehicle with them. Production and maintenance budgets constrained deployment and favored high-value assets that created a stratified battlefield. Frontline formations with advanced active protection could survive heavy exposure while lighter elements remained vulnerable. Commanders had to decide where to allocate limited protections and how to adjust tactics accordingly. Massed rocket attacks sought to saturate active protection by sending multiple rounds within the short time window the system required to engage. Combining ground-based volleys with aerial delivery from unmanned drones created complex attack patterns that stretched sensors and interceptors. The cost-effective attacker tactic became one of volume and surprise. Swarming tactics exploited sensors, reaction times, and logistic limits in urban combat. Attackers carved firing positions that maximized cover and minimized the chance of interception. They aimed at roof and rear arcs where armor was thinner, or they targeted support systems and tracks rather than frontal armor, seeking to produce mission kills rather than total destruction. The net result was a continuous cycle. Designers created armor to meet a new threat. Attackers invented warheads and tactics to defeat that armor. Defenders built new countermeasures and then modified doctrine to cope with the next innovation. Each new device changes how wars are fought and who pays the price. Defensive innovation also left a quieter legacy. It changed strategic thinking about where and how to use armored vehicles. Armored columns became more cautious in urban environments. Rapid advances across open ground required new thinking about screening, reconnaissance, and dismounted infantry support. The presence of a cheap anti-armor tool imposed a constant constraint on initiative. The choice to deploy armor into a contested environment now involved not only vehicle survivability, but also the logistics of sustainment and the political cost of attrition. In that sense, the story of protection is also a story of the limits of power. When a weapon endures for decades, its story becomes less about a single design and more about a pattern of adaptation. The launcher that began as a pragmatic Soviet answer to post-war realities did not simply persist because of nostalgia. It persisted because its logic fit an enduring set of constraints: low cost, ease of manufacture, minimal training requirements, and flexible lethality across many contexts. That combination made it a durable tool of war and a persistent problem for those who sought to stop it. Technological branches sprouted from the original concept. Tandem warheads solved the problem posed by reactive tiles. Advanced standoff charges extended the effective penetration against sloped or composite armor. New propellant chemistries improved consistency in extreme temperatures, and treatments extended shelf life for munitions stored in distant depots. At the same time, designers grafted the warhead onto new delivery platforms. Integration with small unmanned aerial vehicles created a hybrid threat. Drones could approach quietly and strike from above, where armor was thin and angles unprotected by traditional defensive arrays. The marriage of a shaped charge to a remotely piloted platform multiplied the launcher's tactical options while reducing exposure to counterfire. These innovations forced armor designers and commanders into difficult choices. Spending on active protection suites and advanced composites became a necessity for forces that expected to face asymmetric threats. Yet the expense was considerable. Equipping a single vehicle with modern interceptors and sensor suites required budgets far larger than covering simple applique plates. The result was a stratified battlefield in which the most precious assets received layered defenses and lighter formations remained vulnerable. Commanders had to weigh whether to risk expensive platforms in contested environments or to rely on numbers and tactics to limit exposure. The economic calculus extended beyond procurement. Training, logistics, and maintenance all shaped how effective any defensive measure would be. Active protection systems demanded spare interceptors, calibration, and technical crews. Reactive armor tiles needed replacement after use. Even improvised measures imposed costs in mobility, fuel consumption, and wear on suspension systems. In theaters where budgets were limited, the decision often favored tried and true simplicity, which in turn prolonged the life cycle of the small anti-armor launcher that had started it all. There is also a human dimension to the legacy. The weapon made asymmetric struggle more feasible, and thus reshaped political realities. Non-state actors could now threaten conventional forces more credibly. That reality influenced strategies from proxy support to insurgent doctrine. The presence of a cheap but lethal threat shifted bargaining power on the ground and complicated diplomatic efforts to stabilize conflict zones. Neighborhoods once safe became places to avoid, and rebuilding required more than concrete and steel. Trauma shaped generations and hampered recovery long after ceasefires were signed. Ethics and law responded unevenly. The wide availability of a weapon suited to both military and punitive uses blurred lines in conflict. Thermobaric variants and munitions, optimized for urban destruction, raised questions about proportionality and civilian harm. International debates surfaced about transfer controls, about accountability for arms brokers, and about how to prevent illicit flows without restricting legitimate state procurement. Yet enforcement lagged. Borders are porous in many regions, and shadow markets thrive when demand exists. The result was a cycle in which technology moved faster than regulatory frameworks. The tactical theater continued to evolve. Swarming attacks and combined arms platoons attempted to overwhelm defenses or to create multiple axes of threat. Teams learned to mix ground-fired volleys with airborne small platforms, to use suppressive fire to distract active defenses. In turn, defenders refined sensor fusion and attempted to build countermeasures specifically tailored to low-signature, low cross-section threats. Doctrine, training, and intelligence mattered as much as hardware. A persistent irony is that the most advanced systems remain vulnerable to the simplest tactics. Hard kill interceptors are susceptible to saturation. Soft kill measures are ineffective against unguided, human-aimed launches. Complex electronics are vulnerable to weather, terrain, and deliberate countermeasures. For armies that rely on technology, the lesson is cautious humility. No system solves the strategic problem alone. Combined measures, doctrine, and local intelligence form the best defense. And even then, vulnerability remains. Looking forward, the most likely path is not a single breakthrough that makes anti-armor shoulder weapons obsolete. Instead, the foreseeable future looks like ongoing adaptation. Warhead designers will seek new liners and shaped geometries. Propulsion improvements will aim for greater accuracy without sacrificing compactness. Integration with artificial intelligence on both sides will refine targeting, threat detection, and countermeasure activation. Legal and regulatory efforts may tighten some flows, but cannot completely stem the tide of diffusion without broad political solutions to the conflicts that create demand. Perhaps the most important legacy is conceptual. The launcher crystallized a principle about modern conflict. Asymmetry often wins, where cost-effectiveness, adaptability, and human ingenuity intersect. Economies of force can outmaneuver economies of scale. The cheap launcher did not simply defeat armor by brute force. It forced a rethinking of mission design, rules of engagement, and the political calculus of deploying expensive assets into contested spaces. For the individuals who lived through encounters with the weapon, the memories are sharp and unforgiving. Tank crews recount the suddenness of an impact, the way internal alarms and smoke can change a mission in seconds. Infantry veterans remember the terror of urban streets that conceal shooters on every rooftop. Civilians recount homes reduced to rubble by warheads that were designed for armor but found their cruel efficiency in concrete and timber. These human stories give the technical narrative its moral weight. In the end, the story is not solely about a tube and its projectiles. It is a story about adaptation, about how technology and tactics bend and break under pressure. It is a story about the limits of protection and the costs of offense. And it is a story that continues because the pressures that created the launcher remain with us. As long as disparity exists between the resources of combatants and the ingenuity of their adversaries, tools that offer cheap, scalable lethality will continue to shape battlefields and to force hard choices upon commanders, states, and societies. August 16th, 1944. Brandis Airfield, Saxony, Germany. The morning fog settles low across the runway like a sheet of pale smoke, turning the entire field into a quiet arena suspended between expectation and dread. Dew clings to fuel carts, scaffolding, and the canvas covers draped over grounded aircraft. Somewhere near the blast pit, a generator stutters to life, its coughing rhythm echoing across the stillness. A wrench clatters on concrete, followed by a muted curse drowned beneath the hum of machinery. Aircrews move like silhouettes through the haze, each step careful, each motion deliberate, all centered on the strange, volatile machine awaiting them in the dim grey light. Beneath a pulled canvas tarp rests the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, the fastest climbing interceptor the world has ever witnessed, and one of the most dangerous machines ever accepted into military service. A mechanic pulls the tarp away, revealing the sharp, stubby craft shaped more like a rocket than an airplane. Its wings are short and angled like blades. Its fuselage is compact, almost predatory in posture. Even now, with the engine cold and silent, the Comet radiates the silent threat of something engineered at the razor edge of physics and fear. The pilot approaches with measured steps, fully aware that one careless brush of a boot or one misplaced tool could spell disaster. Dotstoff, the concentrated hydrogen peroxide that fuels the Comet, has dissolved uniforms, flesh, and metal. See Stoff, the hydrazine-based mixture that combines with T-Stoff to ignite, reacts without flame or spark the moment it touches the wrong surface. Together, they form the core of the aircraft's terrifying power. Ground crews handle them with ritual-like precision, dressed in protective suits that make them appear like attendants to some unstable deity. Fueling begins under the supervision of several senior technicians. Thin tubes deliver the volatile liquids into the belly of the aircraft. Every man stands ready to leap away should the slightest hiss indicate leaking fuel. Even the grass nearby bears the scars of earlier mishaps. Patches of soil burned into dark, sterile craters. The pilot watches silently, inhaling the chemical bite in the air, knowing that his life depends as much on the crew's steady hands as on any skill he possesses in the cockpit. When the fueling carts retreat toward the blast pit, the atmosphere shifts. The Comet now carries its deadly mixture. The ground crew steps back. A ladder is positioned. The pilot climbs into the cockpit, settling into the tight shell of molded metal and instrument glass. The seat feels like an armored cradle welded to the airframe, built not for comfort but for containment. Every switch, gauge, and lever lies within easy reach. The control stick rests between the pilot's knees. There is no throttle in the conventional sense. No gradual increase of power. The rocket engine operates like a binary force. It is either awake or lifeless. The canopy closes with a heavy clack. Condensation forms instantly at its edges. A thin breath escapes the pilot's mask, fogging the lower corner of the glass. The oxygen hose presses against his chest. The pilot glances over the gauges. Fuel quantities, oxygen pressure, attitude indicators. The Walter HWK rocket engine lurks beneath the cockpit floor, dormant but ready to unleash thrust that could tear apart an unprepared airframe. Far above, the distant rumble of American heavy bombers drifts through the morning sky. Their engines form a deep, rolling resonance that seems to vibrate through the earth itself. The bomber stream approaches from the west, heading toward Leipzig and its surrounding industrial lifelines. Multiple formations stretch for miles, and conventional German fighters have struggled to climb fast enough to intercept them before bombs fall. This is why the Comet exists. This is why pilots like the one now seated within this volatile machine have been tasked to fly something as dangerous to its own pilot as it is to the enemy. The radio crackles faintly as a signal reaches the cockpit. Enemy formation approaching altitude. Interceptor scramble imminent. The pilot steadies his breathing and tightens the straps across his chest. The ground crew pulls the chocks, then sprints toward the safety shelter. The countdown begins, its silent rhythm in the pilot's mind. There is no turning back once ignition begins. The Comet does not allow hesitation. The pilot grips the ignition control. The moment of activation comes without warning. The cockpit erupts with force. A violent thrust slams the pilot into the seat as the rocket ignites, funneling thousands of pounds of explosive power in an instant. The entire runway blurs beneath the aircraft's nose. The fog scatters in rippling waves, torn apart by the shock of acceleration. The Comet leaps forward like a launched projectile, every bolt in its frame vibrating with agonizing intensity. The climb is almost vertical. The pilot's vision narrows under the crushing weight of acceleration. The horizon drops away. The ground shrinks into a patchwork mosaic of grey and green. Altitude builds at a rate incomprehensible to pilots of propeller-driven fighters. The needles on the gauges slam upward. The aircraft slices through the lower clouds, leaving behind a spiraling ribbon of vapor. Within seconds, the pilot passes through altitudes that typically require several minutes for a conventional interceptor. The air thins. The sky darkens. The Comet's rocket engine roars with unrelenting fury. Yet every second of powered flight devours the limited fuel supply. The pilot knows the truth carved into every briefing. Barely enough time to climb and strike the enemy before the aircraft becomes a powerless glider drifting through a hostile sky. The contrails of the American bombers appear like chalk streaks across the upper atmosphere. Long, pale lines etched across the horizon. The pilot angles the Comet, adjusting for the intercept course. The gauges scream warnings. The engine strains. The fuel dwindles. The bomber formation grows larger, shifting from distant shapes to glimmering silhouettes reflecting the early sun. The pilot prepares for the moment the rocket will die, for the jolt of silence that will follow. He presses forward through the violent ascent, chasing the thin, trembling boundary between power and gravity. The rocket flame behind the Comet grows brighter as the aircraft climbs through the thinning atmosphere, and the pilot feels the trembling intensity of the ascent spreading through the metal frame and into his bones. The sky darkens from pale morning blue into a deeper gradient of color as the altitude soars upward at a staggering rate. Below, Brandis Airfield becomes a shrinking patch of grey among fields and forest. Now almost swallowed by the clouds, the aircraft has torn through like fragile curtains. The pilot steadies his breathing, mindful of the crushing pressure against his chest, the relentless acceleration trying to press him deeper into the seat. The gauges before him climb with startling speed, their needles pressing toward limits known only to pilots brave or desperate enough to guide a rocket-powered machine into the upper sky. The cockpit shudders with rapid micro-vibrations. At this altitude and velocity, air behaves differently. The slightest adjustment of the control stick creates amplified response, requiring the pilot to correct with an almost delicate precision that contrasts sharply with the brute violence of the rocket engine beneath him. The canopy creaks softly as external pressure drops. The pilot inhales a thin, filtered breath, feeling the shift in temperature as cold begins to creep through the cockpit walls. Frost traces the inner edges of the glass, gathering into faint patterns that vibrate with each tremor of the ascent. Ahead, the contrails of the approaching American bomber formation stretch across the sky like horizontal spears. The white streaks appear calm and distant, but the pilot knows the truth behind them. Each one marks the presence of a massive aircraft carrying thousands of pounds of bombs destined for Leipzig, factories, and the dwindling industrial arteries of Germany's war effort. Below those bomber columns lurk escort fighters, ready to pounce on any interceptor that dares rise to meet them. Yet the Comet has only one advantage in this deadly equation: astonishing speed. Everything else, from endurance to maneuverability to survivability, remains a gamble. The engine's roar shifts subtly as the last reserves of fuel diminish. The pilot checks the indicator and notes how quickly the level drops. There is no time to hesitate. He angles the Comet toward the edge of the bomber stream, calculating the intercept based on instinct honed through relentless training. The climb remains nearly vertical, but now he nudges the nose into a shallower path that brings the aircraft slicing horizontally toward the shimmering silhouettes in the distance. A moment later, the engine sighs into silence. There is no violent jolt, but the absence of force is sudden and absolute, like stepping into a vacuum. The pilot feels his body shift slightly forward, the crushing weight of acceleration replaced by a strange floating sensation. The Comet transitions into a ballistic arc, carrying forward the enormous momentum gathered during its brief burst of rocket power. The high-pitched whine of the engine fades, leaving only the whisper of wind brushing the canopy. The aircraft no longer climbs. It coasts, gliding at speeds few fighters of the era could ever hope to reach. The silence feels eerie, almost unnatural. Yet this is the phase every Comet pilot knows intimately. The aircraft is now a projectile with wings. Its strike window lasts mere seconds. If the attack fails, the pilot becomes a glider, drifting down through layers of enemy aircraft with no means to accelerate away. The pilot steadies his breathing, aware that the next moments will determine whether he glides home or joins the many rocket interceptors that never returned. The bomber formation grows larger, transforming from distant shadows into vast metal fortresses gleaming beneath the sunlight. Their engines form a deep, resonant hum that vibrates faintly through the thin air. Rows of rotating turrets scan the sky. The pilot can almost sense the watchfulness of the gunners as he closes the distance at velocities no human eye can easily track. The Comet begins to tremble as it slices into the turbulent slipstream behind the bombers. The turbulent air buffets the wings, sending shivers through the fuselage. The pilot adjusts the control stick lightly, guiding the aircraft into an attack angle aimed at the rear of the formation. He aligns the nose toward a bomber on the leftmost edge, where defensive fire tends to be less concentrated. The metallic hull of the enemy aircraft now fills much of his forward view, magnified by speed and proximity. The sunlight glints off the belly turret, and the pilot feels the small muscles in his forearms tighten as he positions the Comet for firing. Tracers erupt from the bombers. Thin, glowing lines streak across the sky, arcing upward like furious sparks thrown from a forge. They appear slow from a distance, but the pilot knows each glowing bead carries lethal velocity. Some pass behind him, others streak underneath. The Comet's momentum renders evasive maneuvers nearly meaningless. so he holds steady, trusting the narrow profile and speed of his aircraft to carry him through the storm. The cannons fire in a powerful burst. The recoil slams backward through the impact frame, and the Comet jolts as if struck from behind. Bright flashes bloom against the enemy bomber's wing root. Panels of metal peel back. Smoke erupts in a thick ribbon, trailing behind the damaged aircraft. The pilot shifts slightly, trying to line up a second shot, but his speed is too great. The bomber slips downward behind him, lost beneath the Comet's tail. The attack window has closed. The pilot now streaks through the formation, weaving between columns of smoke and the expanding plumes of flak shells, exploding above and below. Some peel away from their protective orbits and angle downward on intercept courses. The pilot watches their distant silhouettes with a twinge of apprehension. His aircraft, now without fuel, glides with diminishing velocity. Each passing second erodes his advantage. He angles the Comet downward, slipping between two drifting layers of cloud. The air thickens slightly as altitude drops, granting the control surfaces more authority. The pilot feels the glide stabilize. Though the aircraft remains fast and unsteady, some distance behind, the escort fighters adjust their descent paths, searching for the rocket fighter as it flees beneath the chaos. The pilot begins scanning the landscape below, searching for the designated emergency landing area. The ground remains far away, blurred by altitude and speed, but he recognizes faint outlines of forest, fields, and winding roads. The glide path must be precise. There is no chance for a second attempt. The Comet continues its silent descent, slipping away from the bomber stream as the sky behind erupts in smoke, gunfire, and the faint sparkling trails of tracer rounds. The pilot exhales slowly, calming his pulse as he focuses on guiding the powerless rocket plane toward the earth below. The clouds part beneath him, revealing the patchwork fields of Saxony, stretching out like a vast map drawn in muted greens and browns. The glide home has begun. The clouds peel open as the Comet glides downward, and the pilot feels the weight of gravity return with slow, steady insistence. The rocket-powered violence of the climb has faded into memory, replaced by a silence so complete it seems to press against the canopy. Only the faint whisper of air along the wings reminds him that he is still moving at extraordinary speed. The earth below expands across the horizon, revealing a quilt of fields, dark forests, and scattered paths leading toward distant villages. Fighting the impulse to tense every muscle, knowing that the glide requires precise calm and delicate control, the pilot adjusts the nose angle, testing the aircraft's behavior in the denser air. The Comet begins to wobble slightly, the broad belly fighting occasional gusts of wind. The pilot keeps his hands light on the control stick, mindful that any sudden yank could send the glider into an uncontrolled dive. There is no engine to power out of trouble. The glide must be managed with finesse. Far behind him, faint flashes still bloom in the upper atmosphere, evidence of the ongoing struggle between the bomber formation and German defences. The echoes of explosions drift faintly through the air, flat and distant. The pilot resists the urge to look back. The sky behind him contains only danger. The world ahead holds the narrow hope of survival. He forces his attention downward, scanning the terrain for the designated landing zone assigned to Comet pilots returning from intercept missions. He knows the rules. The landing must be executed on the first attempt. The Comet carries only a simple skid instead of traditional landing gear. Once the aircraft descends too low, there is no powered climb, no chance to circle around, no opportunity to correct major mistakes. The pilot must align perfectly with the chosen field, absorb the impact, and hope the skid does not strike uneven ground or hidden debris. Any violent jolt risks rupturing tank remnants. And even with no active fuel burn, the chemicals that linger inside the fuselage can still react with catastrophic intensity. The pilot levels the glide slightly as he approaches a layer of broken clouds drifting near the mid-altitude zone. Shadows from the clouds pass over the canopy, dimming and brightening the cockpit in alternating pulses. The temperature rises marginally as he descends. The frost that clung to the canopy edges begins to fade, replaced by thin rivulets of moisture that trickle toward the lower frame. He spots the designated emergency landing area moments later. A flat, grassy clearing lies ahead, bordered on one side by a line of forest and on the other by a narrow dirt road. The surface appears damp, likely softened by morning dew, but the length seems adequate. The pilot lifts the nose slightly, adjusting for a more gradual approach. The comet responds with a gentle rise, settling into a smoother glide. Wind streaks along the canopy, creating a rising hum that vibrates faintly across the pilot's helmet. As he nears the clearing, he reaches for the skid deployment lever. The metal mechanism resists for a second before locking into place with a muted vibration that he feels more than hears. The aircraft's nose shifts upward in response, slowing the descent slightly. The pilot tightens his grip on the control stick, aware that the next few seconds hold the most dangerous phase of the entire mission. Even the attack run among the bombers, with tracers slicing past the canopy, feels simpler compared to the peril waiting on the ground. Grass, earth, and scattered clumps of darker soil rise toward the aircraft with accelerating speed. The pilot steadies the comet, angling slightly to avoid a patch of uneven ground he spots near the far end of the field. The seconds stretch as the aircraft sinks lower. The hum of air grows louder, deepening into a sharp whistle. A violent vibration courses beneath the pilot as the metal brace scrapes across the wet grass. The nose dips forward before leveling again. The pilot grits his teeth, fighting the instinct to pull back on the stick. The glide path remains true for several meters before a subtle jolt hits the left side of the skid. The aircraft tilts, threatening to roll. The pilot counters with careful pressure, nudging the control surfaces to correct the drift. The comet continues sliding, tearing long strokes into the grass. Wet clumps of earth spray past the canopy. The cockpit rattles, every bolt quivering beneath the strain. The aircraft finally begins to slow, losing momentum across the soft field. The vibration weakens. The sliding stops. Silence returns. The pilot remains motionless for several moments. His hands rest on the stick, muscles trembling with the residue of adrenaline. Breath fogs the lower corner of the canopy in slow, unsteady bursts. The world outside no longer tilts or rushes. The pilot unstraps his harness with deliberate care, knowing that rushing risks bumping a component or brushing chemical residue. He pushes the canopy open. Cool, earthy air floods the cockpit. The scent of wet soil and grass washes over him, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of T-stoff and C-stoff that still lingers faintly inside the fuselage. He pulls himself out, planting his boots firmly on the damp ground. For the first time since ignition, he feels solid earth beneath him. The pilot steps several paces away from the aircraft, careful not to touch its surfaces. A faint line of disturbed grass behind it marks the path of the landing skid. No chemical steam hisses through hairline cracks. Relief settles through the pilot in a slow exhale. He scans the skies. The distant drone of engines remains high above, but the immediate danger has passed. He stands alone in the clearing, surrounded by fields that stretch gently toward the horizon. The war feels distant for a brief, fragile moment. A bird calls from somewhere in the forest. A light breeze brushes across the grass, carrying the scent of pine. The pilot knows the ground crew will arrive soon. They will navigate the dirt road with specialized retrieval equipment, approach the aircraft with caution, and begin the ritual of neutralizing any traces of volatile fuel. Until then, he remains alone with the machine that hurled him into the sky and returned him safely to Earth. He sits on a patch of flattened grass, letting the adrenaline seep out of his limbs. The silence offers a moment of clarity, but beneath it lies a persistent truth. The mission is not over. The bombers continue their advance. The airfield will need every aircraft ready for the next wave. But for now, in this fleeting pause, the pilot breathes the quiet air of the Earth he has returned to. The clearing gradually returns to stillness as the pilot waits alone beside the grounded comet. the silence punctuated only by the brushing of wind against the tall grass and the distant murmur of engines from the upper sky. The morning sun has climbed higher, turning the droplets of dew into tiny mirrors scattered across the field. The pilot remains alert despite the exhaustion weighing on his limbs. His gaze repeatedly returns to the path he carved across the grass, a reminder that even the landing, the simplest part of flying most aircraft, becomes a precarious ordeal in this rocket-powered interceptor. A faint vibration eventually reaches his ears, the low engine growl of approaching ground vehicles traveling the dirt road beyond the tree line. The sound grows gradually clearer until a retrieval convoy emerges between the branches, moving at cautious speed. The first truck carries technicians in heavy protective suits draped over their shoulders. The second, towing a small tractor fitted with cables and stabilizing arms. As they approach the clearing, the vehicles slow to a steady roll, their engines humming over the soft terrain. The technicians step down from the trucks and spread out through the field. Some approach the aircraft with practiced caution, scanning the grass for any discoloration that might indicate chemical leakage. Others prepare equipment meant to neutralize remnants of T-stoff and C-stoff should any residue seep from microscopic cracks or joints. The pilot stands back while they work, observing the deliberate choreography of a team that has repeated this dangerous ritual countless times. None of them rush. None of them speak loudly. The Comet commands a quiet that resembles reverence as much as fear. Once the fuselage is cleared, the men begin securing the cabling around reinforced points beneath the aircraft's wings. The tractor eases forward, the cables tightening slowly as the aircraft lifts slightly before sliding across the grass. The pilot walks alongside, keeping pace while inspecting the ground for hazards the convoy might not see. The forest recedes as the small procession reaches the road where the vehicles align and begin the journey back toward Brandis Airfield. The ride on the back of the second truck gives the pilot a moment of stillness, but his mind remains active. Fields pass by in blurred patches. The scent of churned earth hangs in the air. He watches the horizon as the Comet travels behind the tractor. The rocket fighter, reduced to an unusual cargo, being escorted home. The contrast between its blistering speed in the sky and its vulnerability on the ground reinforces the delicate balance between power and fragility that defines this aircraft. When the convoy reaches Brandis Airfield, the atmosphere has changed dramatically since the pilot launched earlier that morning. The fog has burned away completely, revealing a hive of activity across the entire base. Mechanics move between hangars, carrying tools and replacement parts. Fuel crews roll carts across the tarmac. Officers stride toward the operations building with folders pressed under their arms. Conventional fighters from nearby units roar overhead in staggered intervals, climbing into the sky with engines strained. The Comet is pulled toward a maintenance hangar, where technicians begin detaching cables and preparing the aircraft for a detailed inspection. The pilot steps aside as engineers swarm around the fuselage, removing panels, checking connectors, and preparing solvent washes to neutralize any lingering chemical vapor. Several men begin recording notes, logging the condition of the skid, the nose structure, and the outer skin that endured the violent ascent. The pilot walks toward the operations building. Inside, the air is heavy with the sound of papers rustling, pencils scratching across logs, and the steady buzz of equipment relaying incoming reports from observation posts. A large map dominates the wall, pinned with colored markers representing enemy bomber paths and projected arrival times. Several officers stand before it, tracing paths with fingers and repositioning markers as new estimates arrive. Another bomber stream is approaching from the west, larger than the one encountered earlier, and its projected route grazes dangerously close to Leipzig's industrial zone. The pilot studies the plotted lines, calculating silently the altitude and intercept points that define each Comet mission. The officers update the predicted crossing time. The second wave will be within reach before long. This realization sends a ripple of urgency through the room. Technicians hurry to prepare additional aircraft. Runners move between buildings, delivering updates. Even the air feels charged, as though the base itself senses the coming impact. He steps outside again, letting the sunlight wash over him as he surveys the runway and the rows of hangars. The metallic scent of machinery fills the air, blending with the faint smell of fuel. A maintenance crew moves a prepared Comet toward the staging area. Protective suits gleam slightly in the sun as technicians make their way toward the fueling zone. The pilot watches closely as the T-STOF and C-STOF fueling carts are pulled into position. The ritual begins again. Two technicians guide the hoses with steady hands. Every movement is measured, and every tool is positioned with meticulous attention. The pilot remembers how many times he has watched this process, each instance feeling like a slow, controlled descent into danger. Even on calm days, fueling a Comet is an ordeal balancing precision and luck. On days when the airfield is bracing for a second wave of bombers, each step seems amplified. He observes the Comet being prepared, its wings catching the sun at sharp angles, its surfaces cleaned of any residue from previous missions. The aircraft appears almost serene, but the pilot knows what lies beneath that metal skin. The moment ignition occurs, serenity becomes violence, and the climb becomes a battle against forces that push both machine and human to the edge of endurance. As preparations continue, the pilot reflects on the earlier mission. The violent recoil of the cannons, the trace lines of enemy fire cutting across the sky, and finally the long descent toward the clearing. Every second a negotiation between calm, precision, and creeping fear. He knows the next mission will carry the same demands, the same gamble. And yet, he also knows that hesitation offers no protection. Air raid sirens begin to wail across the base, their rising and falling tones sending a chill through the air. The pilot looks skyward. The horizon shows faint glints, tiny metallic flickers reflecting the midday sun. The second wave of bombers is nearing visual range. Anti-aircraft batteries around the perimeter begin to prepare, their dark silhouettes turning toward the threat. The pilot moves toward the staging area where crews are finishing the last checks on another Comet. He feels the familiar tension in his chest, the tightening of muscles that precedes every mission. The aircrew stands ready to push the aircraft toward the runway once fueling completes. Engineers step back, checking seals and wiping down connectors. The skid is locked in position. The cockpit canopy stands open, waiting. The sound of bomber engines grows louder, carried across the landscape like a growing tide. The pilot knows the Comet's role is simple in concept, but harrowing in execution. Climb faster than any other aircraft, strike once, and survive the powerless descent. He steps closer to the rocket fighter, the machine that has already hurled him into the sky once today. He inhales deeply, tasting the metallic tang carried by the wind as he prepares to face the second wave. The sound of engines from the west thickens into a layered roar that spreads across Brandis Airfield like a pressure wave, vibrating through the hangar walls and drifting across the open fields. The pilot feels the tension in the air, hardening into something almost physical. Mechanics near the ready zone pause momentarily to glance toward the distant horizon, each of them sensing the approach of another immense formation of American heavy bombers. The low thunder rolling through the sky is unmistakable. It is the sound of countless engines synchronized in a relentless forward march. The pilot steps closer to the Comet now, positioned near the runway. Its fueling completed, its surfaces checked, its components sealed and ready. The canopy stands open, sunlight glinting off the curved glass. The metallic skin of the aircraft gleams with an unnatural sheen, a reminder of both its advanced engineering and the volatile chemicals concealed within its tanks. Technicians in protective suits retreat toward the blast shelter, their movements brisk and purposeful. The airfield's atmosphere tightens like a drawn bowstring. Every sound carries heightened meaning. The bomber formation appears first, as faint glimmers of light reflecting off metal far beyond the tree line. As the pilot watches, those glimmers stretch into long, thin shapes moving in precise alignment. Contrails form behind them, thin white lines slicing across the sky in parallel strokes. The formation resembles a floating fortress city, each element maintaining strict formation as it advances eastward. Between the bombers fly escort fighters, their silhouettes darting in subtle movements along the flanks. The pilot approaches the comet and climbs the small ladder into the cockpit. The familiarity of the tight interior brings a strange mix of reassurance and dread. He settles into the molded metal seat, adjusts the straps across his chest, and checks the oxygen feed. The canopy closes with a solid thud that seals him off from the world outside. The instrument panel glows faintly. A deep breath fills the mask. The morning mission still lingers in his muscles. Yet there is no room for hesitation. The comet demands full commitment every time its engine ignites. Technicians withdraw to a safe distance. The pilot rests his hand lightly on the ignition control, feeling the faint tremor in his fingers. The roar of the bomber formation grows louder, echoing through the canopy as a distant yet overpowering hum. Anti-aircraft batteries surrounding the airfield begin firing, their sharp concussions tearing through the air in rhythmic bursts. Black flak clouds erupt across the sky like scattered ink blots, their fragments glittering momentarily before vanishing into the wind. The pilot steadies himself. Then the rocket ignites. The force slams him backward, compressing his chest and rattling his vision. The comet surges forward with explosive acceleration, tearing across the runway in a blistering streak. The landscape blurs into indistinct shapes as the nose lifts sharply, pulling the aircraft into a near-vertical ascent. The massive surge of thrust presses the pilot deep into the seat as the rocket flame extends behind him in a bright, searing plume. The pilot senses the engine pushing the aircraft toward the edge of its structural limits, the metal skin trembling under the pressure. The sky grows darker as altitude builds at a ferocious pace. The air thins rapidly. This second ascent is not softened by adrenaline, as the first had been. Instead, it carries the heavy familiarity of danger repeated too soon. The pilot's breathing becomes measured and precise as he keeps the control stick steady. Within moments, the comet breaks through the upper layer of clouds. The bomber formation lies ahead, stretching in a vast arc that glimmers in the bright light above the haze. Defensive tracers already scatter across the sky as anti-aircraft batteries from the ground attempt to reach the advancing aircraft. The pilot angles the comet toward the nearest cluster of bombers, adjusting carefully as he enters the complex airflow disturbed by the formation. The rocket engine begins to fade. Fuel levels drop to their final traces. The violent force pushing the pilot backward softens into a diminishing rumble. The pilot braces for the transition. The flame extinguishes a heartbeat later. Silence rushes into the cockpit with startling suddenness. The comet becomes a silent missile, gliding at tremendous speed toward an enemy formation dense with guns. The pilot shifts his angle, aligning the nose with the nearest bomber. The pilot must anticipate the movement of the bomber, the turbulence of the slipstream, and the arc of the gliding comet all at once. He adjusts elevation slightly, feeling the air buffet the thin wings. Then the tracers begin. Bright, glowing streaks curve upward in rapid succession, forming threads of light that move faster than the eye can fully capture. The pilot senses them slicing through the air on all sides. Some streak beneath the comet's belly. Others arc dangerously close to the wings. The pilot feels the air itself trembling from the turbulence of bullets passing near the fuselage. He opens fire. The twin cannons erupt with a deep mechanical pulse, sending a concentrated stream of shells tearing forward. The recoil shudders through the cockpit. Sparks erupt across the nearest bomber's fuselage as shells strike metal. Panels tear loose. Smoke bursts from an engine nacelle. Flames begin to lick along the side of the stricken aircraft as it drops slightly out of formation. The pilot overshoots the bomber almost instantly, the speed of the glide carrying him forward before he can attempt a second burst. Additional tracers flash past him. The escort fighters, previously orbiting above the formation, now react. Several break formation and dive toward the comet, their intentions unmistakable. The pilot banks sharply, trying to slip into the cover of a patch of drifting clouds. But the comet's momentum makes such maneuvers sluggish. The glide carries him onward in a downward arc that the pursuing fighters exploit. Their silhouettes grow clearer through the canopy as they descend. The pilot feels the air shifting again, the pressure building as the glide continues into denser layers of atmosphere. The escorts begin their approach. The pilot dips into a steeper glide, angling toward the cloud bank below. The airflow thickens. The comet responds with sharper movements, though the speed remains dangerously high. The pilot adjusts the trim slightly, trying to stabilize the glide path as he descends further. Faint shadows appear within the cloud layer. The escorts disappear momentarily behind the whiteness. The pilot emerges on the lower side of the cloud, scanning rapidly for the landmarks that signal the emergency landing area. He spots a clearing far to the east of the airfield, familiar from earlier missions. The escorts above hesitate, searching the layer of clouds for the descending aircraft. He stabilizes the approach, mentally preparing for the skid landing sequence once more. The clearing grows larger in the canopy, revealing the dark outline of trees along its edge. The pilot holds steady. He heads toward the Earth again. Through the quiet descent that follows the fury of combat above, the ground rises toward the descending comet in a restrained but inevitable rush, and the pilot keeps both hands tightly wrapped around the control stick as he adjusts the glide path. The clearing that appeared distant only moments before now expands rapidly, its boundaries sharpening with every meter lost to gravity. The grass below displays a muted sheen from the afternoon light, bending gently under the wind that pushes across the open terrain. Beyond the clearing lies a thin band of forest, its dark treetops swaying like a line of watchful sentinels, observing the silent return of the rocket-powered machine. The sky above remains filled with distant thunder. The deep, rolling sound of the bombers reverberates across the upper atmosphere, mixing with the faint cracking booms of anti-aircraft fire. The battle raging far above no longer belongs to him. His mission has already been defined by the narrow arc of fuel, spent moments after ignition, and now his survival depends entirely on the glide. He lowers the nose slightly, letting the comet gather a touch more speed to stabilize the descent. The aircraft vibrates faintly as it cuts through the shifting pockets of air over the clearing. The landing skid waits beneath the fuselage. The pilot reaches for the deployment lever, pulling it with careful pressure and feeling the metal brace engage under the aircraft. The shift alters the airflow slightly, lifting the nose just enough to ease the glide. The pilot breathes once through his mask, steady and measured, and prepares for impact. The clearing stretches wide, but the margin for error remains cruelly small. A hidden dip in the ground, or the slightest misalignment, could rupture a fuel line or strain a joint weakened by the intense ascent. Even the unburned remnants of T-stoff and C-stoff can turn a minor collision into a catastrophic fire. The skid meets the ground with a force that ripples through the cockpit. The impact sends a harsh shudder along the aircraft's spine. The comet drags forward, ploughing across the damp grass and tearing furrows in the soil. The pilot braces himself, resisting the instinct to pull sharply on the controls. The nose dips momentarily, before rising again as the aircraft stabilizes. Grass and dirt streak across the canopy. The vibrations weaken gradually as the comet slows across the clearing, finally losing momentum until it settles with a faint metallic groan. His pulse thunders in his ears, masking the soft whisper of wind outside. He inhales deeply, feeling the burn of tired lungs fighting against the tightness in his chest. Moments pass before he reaches for the canopy latch. The glass lifts slowly, releasing a rush of fresh air scented with earth and pine. He steps out cautiously, boots sinking slightly into the soft, torn grass. The comet rests at an angle, its wings damp, the fuselage streaked with grass stains and mud. The pilot walks several meters away from the aircraft, giving it the respectful distance due to a machine still dangerous even at rest. He studies the sky. The bomber stream continues its steady progress beyond the clearing, now appearing slightly lower on the horizon. Faint pillars of smoke rise from distant industrial areas. The aftermath of their deadly payloads, the pilot feels the familiar hollow sensation that follows every mission. the knowledge that his single strike has done little to alter the tide. He waits for the retrieval convoy, listening for the sound of engines from the road. The airfield lies too far to see directly, but the path between the clearing and Brandis has become familiar after repeated landings. A soft rustle comes from the nearby trees, where wind pushes through the branches. The calm of the landscape contrasts starkly with the violence unfolding in the sky above. The pilot wipes a thin streak of moisture from his gloves, letting the moment settle around him like a brief pause between echoes of battle. Eventually, the faint engine hum appears once more. The retrieval convoy approaches, moving with the same cautious precision as before. Technicians step down from the vehicles, scanning the clearing for any signs of leaking propellant. Their suits reflect the afternoon light as they move toward the Comet. They examine the skid, the seams of the fuselage, and the underside where unspent fuel might have collected. Once satisfied, they attach cables to reinforced hooks beneath the wings. The tractor moves forward gently, pulling the aircraft onto a flatter portion of ground. The pilot assists by signaling directions as necessary. The Comet glides reluctantly across the damp earth. Despite its mastery of the sky, on the ground it behaves more like a wounded creature being pulled to safety. When the convoy reaches the dirt road, the pilot climbs into the back of the second truck, settling onto the wooden bench as the engine rumbles to life. The ride toward Brandis Airfield unfolds in a strange silence, broken only by the occasional thump of the vehicle passing over uneven terrain. The afternoon sun glints off its metal surface. Even damaged and grounded, the aircraft seems to radiate the lingering spirit of its astonishing capabilities. Yet beneath that beauty lies the harsh truth understood by every member of the unit. Speed alone cannot win a war. As the convoy arrives at Brandis, the airfield reveals the cost of the day. Smoke drifts from a distant hangar where a near miss from a bomber's payload landed earlier. Crews rush between buildings carrying equipment and stacking crates. A few conventional fighters sit damaged along the edge of the tarmac, their wings and fuselages marked by shrapnel fragments. A mixture of determination and exhaustion lingers across the faces of those who still labor under the threat of returning bombers. The Comet is pulled into a maintenance hangar where engineers begin their post-flight examination. Panels are removed. Gauges are checked. Residue on metal surfaces is neutralized with specialized powders. The pilot watches the process for a moment before leaving the hangar to stand near the open runway. The sky above has begun to shift from bright afternoon to a softer shade of gold as the sun edges closer to the horizon. The fading thunder of the bomber formation grows distant, replaced gradually by quieter sounds across the airfield. The pilot remains by the runway, reflecting on the trajectory of the day. 2 missions in a single period of daylight. 2 ascents into danger. 2 descents filled with uncertainty. And still the bombers press on. He observes a small group of engineers discussing structural vulnerabilities discovered in multiple aircraft. Their gestures point toward the sky, toward the horizon, toward the debris fields left behind by downed interceptors. The Comet, for all its brilliance, its unmatched speed offers a brief moment of advantage, but afterward comes silence and gravity and the vulnerability of powerless descent. The pilot closes his eyes briefly, feeling the lingering tremor in his hands soften as the wind cools the sweat on his skin. He looks again toward the horizon. The sky has quieted. The bombers have vanished beyond sight. The airfield settles into that uneasy calm that follows every major raid. And yet, the pilot knows dawn will bring another call, another ascent, another glide, another moment balanced on the thin line between triumph and disaster. The Comet gleams inside the hangar as mechanics continue their work, preparing it once again for the sky. The pilot takes one final breath of the evening air and turns toward the barracks. The day draws to a close, but the fate of the rocket-powered interceptor remains bound to the uncertain future that hangs over the war. The sky dims. The engines fall silent. Brandis Airfield prepares for the next morning.